Hey everybody, tonight's video is called Love for Wickedness, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Hosea, where we're going to be looking at the prophet speaking about an oven, bread, and a dove. So we are in the mid-section of the book, chapter 7, and we're going to open up with verse 1 through 3. And it says, "When I would have healed Israel, then the iniquity of Ephraim was uncovered, and the wickedness of Samaria, for they have committed fraud. A thief comes in, a band of robbers takes spoil outside. They do not consider in their hearts that I remember all their wickedness. Now their own deeds have surrounded them. They are before my face. They make a king glad with their wickedness, and princes with their lies." So Samaria represents the northern kingdom as a capital. And Ephraim also refers to the northern kingdom, and they have deceived even themselves, and they willfully forgot that the Lord saw and remembered their sin. And there's many church-going people today alike who think that they can do whatever they want. They think that God forgets or doesn't see the things that they're doing, living in dark lives. And they appear as holy, but outside of you, they're living in habitual adultery, premarital sex, pornography. They're living as drunkards, dependent on drugs. And many right now are just focused on speaking out against the LGBTQ and the abomination of pride that they celebrate. But we should not forget the other sins that God hates. And God was willing to heal Israel from their sin and its effects, but not as long as they acted as if God didn't see their sin. And never forget, God remembers all unrepentant and uncovered sin. And the royal leaders should provide moral leadership, but they have savored instead of the evil and treachery of those around them, as seen in 2 Kings 15. Verse 8 through 30. In verse 4 through 7, it says, "They are all adulterers. Like an oven heated by a baker, he ceases stirring the fire after kneading the dough until it is leavened. In the day of our king, princes have made him sick, inflamed with wine. He stretched out his hand with scoffers. They prepare their heart like an oven while they lie in wait. Their baker sleeps all night. In the morning it burns like a flaming fire. They are all hot like an oven and have devoured their judges. All their kings have fallen. None among them calls upon me." So the civil leaders burned the civil leaders' evil lust burned so passionately all night that the prophet repeatedly described it as a consuming oven here, so hot that the baker would forgo stirring the fire during the entire night and still have an adequate heat for baking in the next morning. In the political life of Israel, the wickedness infested led to a series of violent assassinations against its kings, seen in 2 Kings 15, verse 8 through 30. And some believe that specifically the assassination of Pekah is the focus of verse 4 through 7. But I want to reread verse 5. It says, "In the day of our king, princes have made him sick, inflamed with wine. He stretched out his hand with scoffers." So a royal celebration becomes an occasion for drunkenness, which in turn fuels more wickedness, as seen also in 1 Kings 16, verse 9 through 10, Amos chapter 6, verse 6, and Proverbs 31, verse 4 and 5. In verse 6 said, "They prepare their heart like an oven while they lie in wait. Their baker sleeps all night. In the morning it burns like a flaming fire." So those plotting against the king is spoken of in verse 6, perhaps the priests. And verse 7 again says, "They are all hot like an oven and have devoured their judges. All their kings have fallen. None among them calls upon me." So four of Israel's final 6 kings were murdered by tyrants, and none of these leaders have called upon God. And Israel's heart was inflamed with desire and passion after idols, like the coals of a fleshly stoked fire ready to bake bread. And they may have continued in sacrifice, as we saw back in Hosea chapter 5 verse 6, but it was an empty ceremony. In verse 8 through 10, Ephraim has mixed himself among the peoples. Ephraim is a cake unturned. Aliens have devoured his strength, but he does not know it. Yes, gray hairs are here and there on him, yet he does not know it. And the pride of Israel testifies to his face, but they do not return to the Lord their God, nor seek him for all of this. So, at Israel's invitation, foreign nations made deliberating inroads into her national and religious life. And this intrusion was making her like a cake, unturned, burned on one side and raw on the other, which is probably what would happen if I was to make a cake. But payment for this foreign assistance was devouring her strength and making her old feeble without noticing it. And Israel had a shift in alliance with Egypt, Philistia, Aram, and Assyria. And Israel had a foolish national policy as she refused to turn to the Lord. And Israel's blindness is attributed to the stubborn arrogance that testifies against her. And the only hope Israel had was turning back to the Lord, as the prophet Amos also preaches in his book in Amos chapter 4, verse 6 through 12. And Lord willing, we'll be looking at that right after the 4th of July. And so we see that in thinking they could serve both the Lord and idols, Israel was like an unturned pancake, burned on one side as if I cooked it, and uncooked on the other. And man has an amazing ability to deceive himself when he is in sin. As Jeremiah said, that the heart is deceptive above all things, in Jeremiah 17 verse 9. And some are already far from God and suffering the effects, even though they can't see it. And Israel was kind of like a foolish old man who thinks and acts like he's a kid. And so verse 11 and 12 says, Ephraim also is like a silly dove without sense. They call to Egypt, they go to Assyria. Wherever they go, I will spread my net on them. I will bring them down like birds of the air, and I will chastise them according to what their congregation has heard. So now we see the picture of a dove given by the prophet Hosea. And a dove is reputed to lack a good sense. So Israel had sought assistance from her neighbors near her, like Egypt and Assyria, rather than from the Lord. And we covered the foolishness back in chapter 5 of putting your hope in man and putting the Lord on the side. And so Egypt and Assyria would ultimately trap her, as we're going to see coming up in the very next chapter next week after Topical Saturday. And doves in Hosea's time, as mentioned, they were known to be easy to trap. And the Lord's net of judgment will come down upon fit in Israel. And Israel's guilt is increased according to what they have heard. And one thing we need to know is greater knowledge means greater accountability. And that's why you see that James chapter 3 verse 1 says that teachers are going to be judged more strictly. God's leaders, shepherds, are going to be judged more strictly, because greater knowledge comes with greater accountability. In verse 13 says, Woe to them, for they have fled from me. Destruction to them, because they have transgressed against me. Though I have redeemed them, yet they have spoken lies against me. So redeem them from Egypt and their other enemies. The Mosaic law back in Leviticus 27 verse 27 through 31 meant to buy back, as in commercial, for redeemed. And it is used of Israel's deliverance from bondage back in Exodus 13:15 and Deuteronomy 7 verse 8, Deuteronomy 9:26 and Deuteronomy 15:15. And also what we'll see, Lord willing, in August when we go through the book of Micah chapter 6 verse 4. And verse 14 through 16 says, "They did not cry out to me with their heart. When they wailed upon their beds, they assembled together for grain and new wine. They rebelled against me, though I disciplined and strengthened their arms. Yet they devised evil against me. They returned, but not to the Most High. They are like a treacherous bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword, for the cursings of their tongue. This shall be their derision in the land of Egypt." And so that's where chapter 7 comes to an end. "And wailed up on their beds and assembled together" may speak of the appeals to the pagan fertility gods upon beds of sacred prostitution, while the latter, if in the marginal reading is correct, hearkens to Elijah's encounter with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel back in 1 Kings 18:28. And cutting oneself is a pagan Canaanite ritual to cause Baal to intervene on one's behalf, as seen in 1 Kings 18, verse 26 through 29. And the cursing of the tongue is directed against God, capital G, God, and his prophets. And the Egyptians would soon mock at the fall of those who have solicited their only help, only intermittently. And Hosea adds another image of a faulty bow that won't shoot an arrow straight. And everything that came from Israel missed the mark because they were like a treacherous bow, a useless and dangerous weapon. And so to wrap up tonight, we look at how Hosea says Israel had the heart like an oven with sinful ignorance and willful blindness. And thankfully, we have the new covenant promise by the prophet Jeremiah that we find in Jeremiah 31, verse 31 through 34, where God forgets our sin through the atoning work of Jesus Christ. And Jesus is the substitution. He was crucified in our place. And I want to go over to Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. Galatians chapter 6, verse 7, it says, "Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, he will also reap." So keep this verse in Galatians in mind if you are willfully blinded and spiritually ignorant. In verse 4 through 7 of Hosea 7 showed us Israel's heart is inflamed after idols. And burning lust was spoken of by the Apostle Paul. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. First Corinthians chapter 7, verse 9. And it says here, I'm actually going to bump it up to verse 8. So 1 Corinthians 7, 8, and 9 says, "But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion." So we see the burning picture used by Paul speaking on marriage there. In Hosea chapter 7, verse 8 through 10, showed that the pride and stubbornness of Israel. In verse 11 and 12 showed Israel like a dove flying about to the nations. And we covered how greater knowledge meant greater accountability. Let's go to Luke chapter 12, verse 48. Luke 12:48 says, "But he who did not know, yet committed these committed things deserving of stripes shall be beaten with a few. For everyone to whom much is given, from him much will be required, and to whom much has been committed of him, they will ask the more. So Jesus couldn't have said it any better in regard that greater knowledge means greater accountability. In the chapter, it ends with Israel ran away from God and run into the nations. And now we are halfway through our study here in the book of Hosea. In this book, we only got like 2 more weeks left of study of it before we go into the next minor book. And so we'll see in next as we'll be looking at how apostasy leads to sowing and weeping next week for the Hosea study. However, we have a topical Saturday, number 13, to be announced tomorrow. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. God bless, and we'll see you tomorrow for Topical Saturday.